Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. June 4th, 1943, Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. Imagine leaning over a small notebook by the window of a rattling coach as the rails hum beneath you, the way Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt did, while a pencil shakes in your hand. Would you dare write a sentence that, if your own officers found it, could land you in solitary confinement? He did. The Americans must be lying to us. How else could a nation at war on two fronts bathe its countryside in light? Look with him through that glass. Electric bulbs burn in every farmhouse, spill from every shop window, flare at each street corner, an unbroken galaxy of wattage thrown across the Texas plains at 10 o'clock at night. Now, place yourself back in Germany, where blackout rules since 1940 have smothered the Reich in darkness, and remember that even before the war, barely a fifth of rural farms ever saw a switch on the wall. Yet here, in the very land Nazi broadcasts had painted as decadent and collapsing, electricity does not trickle, it gushes, like water under pressure. The train hisses to a halt, and 1,150 veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps step down, not from cattle cars, not from rattling freight wagons, but from cushioned Pullman coaches fitted with dining service and sleeping berths. Can you hear the murmur of the crowd? Because the whole town of Mexia has come out to watch. None of them know it, not yet, but this arrival is the first blow in what will become the most profound psychological shift in modern POW history. A deliberate, methodical unmaking of Nazi ideology by nothing more and nothing less than the spectacle of American industrial might. Ask yourself, if victory has a language, is it spoken in battle orders or in production figures? The arithmetic of Allied triumph is even now being set in type, not on a general's map, but in the statistics that will soon dismantle every conviction these men carry about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. Roll back 3 weeks. The collapse begins on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim Rommel's successor lays down arms, and with him roughly 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers are taken. The numbers wobble as stragglers surrender in the days that follow. But the truth is fixed. The Wehrmacht's hard-bitten desert professionals men who had driven the British to Egypt and won even Montgomery's grudging respect are prisoners overnight. Among them stands Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, Iron Cross First Class on his chest, a veteran of the France campaign, twice wounded in North Africa. Decades later, his diary will surface in the National Archives, a time capsule for historians, the most granular record of how American captivity could tunnel into a German soldier's mind and rearrange the furniture. From the sting of defeat to the dawning of revelation, the route runs through the port of Oran, Algeria. Picture the scene at Oran, Radke and 30,000 other POWs penned in makeshift compounds, staring out to the harbor where transports wait like steel islands. You might expect chaos. Instead, watch how American efficiency begins to pry open the plate armor of their preconceptions. The U.S. Army moves thousands a day as if on rails. Files appear, cameras click identity cards, photographed and sorted. Medical staff bend over cots. Exams are conducted, inoculations given. Then, a surprise. Geneva Convention rights explained, cleanly and in fluent German, by American officers trained for this exact encounter. Does it unsettle you to hear your enemy speak your language with such practiced assurance? But the first real fracture arrives on the tongue. Food. Taste it. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, will write to his mother 8 months later. In the cage at Oran, while we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. What would you have thought standing in his boots, chewing that soft bread, inhaling coffee that smelled like home? Would you begin to ask whether everything you'd been told could survive the evidence on your plate? Picture the moment you realize the show isn't a show at all. We assumed it was theater propaganda designed to dazzle us. How could it be anything else? And yet the trays kept coming. Only later did we learn that what stunned us wasn't a special feast, but standard U.S. military rations. Let that sink in. The everyday fare of a nation at war on two fronts looked to men from the Africa Corps like a staged banquet. Ask yourself, if this is ordinary, what must abundance look like? Even the ships themselves lectured us without saying a word. The Liberty vessels that would haul us across the Atlantic were monuments in steel to American industry. Think of the SS Robert E. Peary. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel to sea at Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. If you had told any of us that number before capture, we would have laughed and called it impossible propaganda. Yet there it stood in the record-hard fact, not rumor. At the peak, these ships slid into the water at a rhythm of 3 per day. They had just finished delivering supplies to the European front. Rather than returning empty, they took on a different cargo us. By the summer of 1943, as many as 30,000 prisoners of war each month were crossing the ocean in their holds. The July crossing became Phase 2 in the quiet demolition of certainties. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept notes that later surfaced in letters home. He watched the crew scrape the remains from their plates and tip them into bins food waste each day, exceeding what his entire company had received in a week during those final lean months in Africa. Half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, milk poured away by the gallon because it had lingered too long. They did not do this to taunt us. They did it unthinkingly, a reflex born of a supply line that to them felt bottomless. What would you conclude, seeing that casual gesture repeated day after day, and then the ship itself turned into a floating syllabus on American power? We learned that our transport was one of 2,710 Liberty ships that would be completed during the war, each a jigsaw of some 250,000 parts pulled together from workshops scattered across 32 states. The guards, chatty and proud, explained how even the engines came from 3 separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders that would be married together at ports barely on a map 2 years earlier. Imagine the implication: not one factory, but many; not one port, but a network conjured almost overnight. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Steuben-Prussian, aristocrat, a man whose line had fought since Frederick the Great, later recalled his first glance at the radar antenna turning above the bridge as they neared the American coast. Radar, he believed, was a specialized weapon, scarce even among the British. Yet here it was, standard equipment on a cargo ship. It was then, he wrote, I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war. If your opponent installs your secret on merchant vessels, what does that say about scale? August 2nd, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The shore came into focus, and with it, the last brittle shards of the myth of American weakness. Norfolk sprawled across 4,300 acres. Its docks ran on and on, cranes striding over the piers as they loaded and unloaded dozens of ships at once. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than Hamburg could move in a week. Gefreiter Johann Weber, once a factory hand in the Ruhr, tried to count what his eyes could hardly credit: 47 cargo ships in various stages of work. Watch his pencil scratch in the secret diary as he notes each crane lifting what would have demanded a dozen men and horses back home, and doing it with smooth, tireless electric power, not the coal smoke cough that stained German industrial skies. Can you feel the mental arithmetic begin to break down? They formed us into columns and marched us toward the waiting trains. Along the way, another revelation. Parking lots jammed with civilian automobiles, hundreds belonging to dock workers. In Germany, private cars were the preserve of the rich and the well-placed party man. The Volkswagen promised, since 1934, remained a poster more than a product, with fewer than 1,000 ever reaching civilians. Yet here, ordinary laborers arrived at their shifts behind their own steering wheels. What story do you tell yourself when the decadent society looks so effortlessly mobile? Then came the knockout no one expected. The trains, not boxcars, not the 40 and 8 wagons, 40 men, or 8 horses that had carried our troops across a continent. Full passenger coaches, Pullman cars with padded seats that folded into bunks, dining cars where white tablecloths lay smooth and silver cutlery gleamed, observation cars with panoramic windows framing a moving theater of a country at work. Hauptmann Radke would write, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." Even the guards seemed half ashamed of the comfort. One sergeant apologized that the air conditioning in our car was misbehaving air conditioning in August. We had believed such luxury confined to Hitler's special train. What happens to ideology when it meets chilled air? Over 3 days, the rails beat westward from Norfolk toward the camps in Texas and Oklahoma, and with every mile the edifice of belief cracked further. Press your forehead to the glass with them as the cars slide through Virginia and beyond. Small towns, Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, flared with light as though competing with the stars. In Germany, such places might have nursed a single electric lamp on the square. Here, shop windows blazed, neon signs flickered, houses glowed with multiple rooms alight. Factories pulsed through the night shift, windows bright, parking lots full even at midnight. Obergefreiter Müller, his father a Nazi bloc leader in Hamburg, would later write in a letter unearthed in 1987, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Everyone had more electricity than all of Hamburg." The guards, matter of fact, added the final stroke. This was normal. Every American town, they said, had enjoyed electric service since the 1920s. If light is a language, what were those towns saying to men who had been taught to expect darkness? He called me a fool. I called him a liar. The American guard only smiled and said, "You'll see." When the train stopped at Roanoke, Virginia, for water and coal, the proof was everywhere. Picture the scene: a rail yard alive with motion, machines gliding through tasks that would have taken German workers hours. Automated coal loaders poured black rock with mechanical precision. Electric pumps filled the boilers. Lubrication systems hissed and spun like clockwork. 30 minutes, that was all. In Germany, the same stop would have swallowed 2 hours. Imagine watching this through the window, realizing that even the most mundane operation here moved at the speed of invention. But what struck hardest wasn't the machinery, it was the men. American railway workers with leather boots so fine a German laborer might labor 2 months to buy them. They drank Coca-Cola straight from glass bottles, then tossed them away without a glance. Cigarettes dangled constantly from their lips, half-smoked, half-finished, half-cared for. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, once an electrical engineer at Siemens, scribbled in his journal that this single rail yard consumed more electricity in an hour than his entire Berlin district in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote later. They left lights burning in empty buildings, electric fans spun in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. What kind of world could afford such indifference? As the trains thundered into Tennessee and Kentucky, the windows framed a vision of industrial power beyond imagination. Endless factories stretched to the horizon, plants larger than entire towns back home. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee ran for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces devouring 175,000 kilowatts more than the city of Munich itself. Near Louisville, the prisoners passed Rubber Town, a landscape of synthetic rubber factories that had sprung from bare fields in just 18 months. 4 vast complexes, each employing thousands, turning out 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber every year. Germany, the birthplace of the process, had never exceeded 120,000 tons, even at its best. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, watched through the window and understood instantly. "I knew those plants," he said years later in an interview. "I saw the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers, each one more advanced than anything we had built, and there were 4 just in that one place. The guards told us there were dozens more." Imagine the blow of that realization, that your enemy had outpaced not just your army, but your science itself. Then came Detroit. Even from miles away, the Ford Willow Run plant loomed a city under one roof. Built in 9 months, it produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. 42,000 workers, 1.5 million parts, 1 out of 500 subcontractors feeding one unbroken line of production. The plant swallowed 2.5 million square feet of space and more electricity than the whole of Cologne. Hauptmann Werner Kleist, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window glass. He counted 17 bombers in various stages of completion. "We had been told their planes were inferior, cheaply built," he wrote later, "but I could see the precision, the order. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we believed possible." The deeper into America the trains rolled, the more the illusions died. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge. Below them, barges drifted by, each carrying more grain than Germany had harvested in an entire season. Grain elevators lined both banks, titans of concrete and steel, each holding enough wheat to feed a city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in disbelief, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition, endlessly, carelessly. I watched a single barge loaded with enough wheat to feed my village for 5 years. The crane operator ate a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." By the time they reached Kansas City, the air itself was heavy with the scent of meat. The train halted near the vast stockyards where tens of thousands of cattle waited their turn. Meat-packing plants roared day and night, their smokestacks breathing out the smell of abundance. German prisoners, men who had survived months on 200 grams of meat a week, watched dock hands bite into beef sandwiches as casually as children eating fruit. They ate meat like we ate bread, wrote Gefreiter Paul Fischer. No, that's wrong. They ate meat the way we wished we could eat bread. He described how one American guard bought them hamburgers from a stand near the station meat, cheese, vegetables, white bread for 15 cents apiece. He bought 20 without a thought, paid with a single dollar bill. This was not a feast. This was their normal food. And then Texas. Camp Hearn raised in 4 months from empty earth weighted behind barbed wire and sunlight. Between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners lived there in conditions that many had never known as civilians. Wooden barracks wired for electricity, flush toilets, hot showers, steam heating. Each building, one engineer calculated, had used more lumber than some entire German villages. The camp hospital stunned the German medical staff. They had expected neglect, perhaps brutality. Instead, they found order, cleanliness, and equipment that rivaled university clinics back home. It was, in every sense, the final stage of their education, a slow, relentless dismantling of a worldview, brick by brick, watt by watt. Step into the infirmary with him, Oberarzt, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, Chief Surgeon of the 164th Light Division, and feel his disbelief harden into certainty. He had braced for scarcity. Instead, he stood inside a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines hummed. Surgical suites gleamed. Cabinets brimmed with pharmaceuticals that had been unobtainable in Germany since 1941, yet here they were, standard issue for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, he would later testify, this miracle drug we had only heard rumors about, and they used it freely, even for minor infections among POWs. Pictured a moral whiplash. German soldiers dying for lack of basic sulfa drugs, while Americans administered their most advanced medicine without a flicker of hesitation. The camp kitchen became another lecture hall in the University of Abundance. Men assigned to cook discovered walk-in refrigerators that breathed cold, electric mixers that never tired, automated dishwashers devouring stacks of trays, and gas ranges vast enough to feed 5,000 at a sitting. The daily ration? Fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread quantities German civilians had not seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, once a hotel chef in Munich, stared into the refuse bins and wrote with a kind of shame. Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. The American regulations require we prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner receives full rations. The surplus is discarded. I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage. What ideology survives the sound of good bread hitting a metal can? By September 1943, necessity wrote the next chapter. A labor shortage in American agriculture opened fields and factories to POW workers across the country. Irony of ironies. A decision driven by need accomplished what no propaganda campaign could, an unfiltered tour of the American heartland. Trucked daily to job sites, prisoners rode with eyes uncovered and roots unrestricted. They saw everything, endless rectangles of corn and wheat, plants running 3 shifts under lights that never dimmed, shop windows stacked with goods, parking lots packed with cars, houses where refrigerators and radios were as ordinary as doorbells. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang stood slack-jawed as a single machine did in 1 hour what his village could not have processed in a month by hand. The gin drew power from the Colorado River Authority part of a rural electrification drive that had brought electricity to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, Lang noted. Not aristocracy, not a party member, just a farmer. Yet the man had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, a tractor, and his workers, including the Negroes, opened lunch boxes fuller than the weekly provisions of many German laborers. And this was normal, Lang wrote. Every farm we passed was the same. Ask yourself, when normal looks like this, what becomes of the myth of decadence and collapse? Farther north, Nebraska's sugar beet fields unspooled to the horizon, mechanized in ways that mocked muscle and time. A single combine harvester, the prisoners learned, could do the work of 100 men. Fields ran so large they seemed to swallow counties. Farmers spoke of yields that sounded like fairy tales to European ears, 60 bushels of wheat per acre, compared with Germany's 30 on the best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, assigned to a farm outside Scottsbluff, wrote with a mixture of awe and bitterness. The farmer's son, a boy of 16, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father had earned in his lifetime. When Hoffmann said as much, the boy laughed and replied, it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be better still. If a teenager's not particularly good machine eclipses a lifetime's wages, how strong can your old arithmetic remain? For those sent near American factories, the revelations cut deepest. Geneva Convention rules barred them from direct war production, but they could fill roles that freed citizens for military work and administrative nuance that opened doors into the engine rooms of prosperity. At a Campbell's soup plant in New Jersey, prisoners watched lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than many German facilities could manage in a month. The staff? A skeleton crew of women and elderly men. Most of the young were in uniform, and still the output surpassed peacetime levels. Stabsfeld-Webel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant, cataloged each shock. Everything was automated, he recorded, electric conveyor belts murmuring without pause, automatic filling machines metering with metronomic precision, steam cookers swallowing hundreds of cans at once. Can you feel the ground shifting under their feet? With every belt that whirred and every gauge that held steady, an old world receded, and a new, one louder, brighter, faster declared itself beyond dispute. One elderly woman sat at a control panel that would have required 50 workers in Germany, calmly, effortlessly sipping coffee, while a radio murmured beside her. Imagine the shock of watching that, a single person doing the work of an entire team, automation woven so deeply into daily life it had become invisible. Near Detroit, another group of prisoners unloading coal glimpsed the automotive colossus that had turned itself into an arsenal. Across the river loomed the River Rouge complex, 100,000 workers strong, forging jeeps, tank engines, aircraft. It devoured 1.5 million kilowatts of power every day, more than the entire city of Hamburg. We could see the parking lots, wrote Obergefreiter Franz Kellner, thousands of cars belonging to workers. In Germany, even our officers rarely owned cars. Here, factory laborers drove to work. The guard said many owned two, one for work, one for family. We thought he was mocking us. By the winter of 1943, such scenes had accumulated like weight upon the mind. American intelligence officers even coined a term for it: ideological collapse syndrome. Reports from the Provost Marshal General's Office's Secret Special Projects Division, an experimental re-education program, described POWs who no longer argued when shown production statistics. "They have seen too much," Major Paul Newland wrote that December. "The most fanatical Nazis have become quiet. They still call themselves loyal Germans, but they no longer speak of victory. Many openly question what they were told about America." The change surfaced in print. Camp newspapers run by the prisoners themselves shifted tone. Der Ruf, The Call, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually moved from stiff defiance to essays on democracy, economics, and rebuilding after the war. Editors chosen for their anti-Nazi leanings found their audience growing hungry for such discussions. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed the censors, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, ruled by Jews, incapable of true strength. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals." Then came the blow from an unexpected direction: the treatment of Italy's soldiers after the September 1943 armistice. Italian POWs who agreed to cooperate were reorganized into Italian service units, given better quarters, higher pay, greater freedom. German prisoners watched their former allies working side by side with Americans, dining in their restaurants, some even courting American women. Hauptmann Friedrich Schulz observed bitterly, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we treated them as allies. They work freely, earn money, send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own system." And then Christmas 1943. If all else had chipped at belief, that season shattered it. American churches, civic groups, and relief organizations sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners' men who, only months before, had been trying to kill their sons and brothers. Each parcel held cigarettes, candy, toiletries, games. Local communities invited POWs to Christmas dinners, though rules kept most behind the wire. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the Methodist choir sang carols in German. Women from the town baked cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts delivered hand-drawn greeting cards. Imagine standing there behind the fence, the winter air scented with cinnamon and coffee, hearing the voices of your enemy, singing your own Christmas hymns. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have husbands and sons fighting our armies. Yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness." What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those certain of victory and secure in their power. The Christmas feast that followed would defy comprehension and mark the moment when ideology finally bowed to humanity. Imagine it. Long wooden tables stretching down the barracks, covered not with rations but with a feast turkey, ham, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, bowls of vegetables, pies steaming fresh from the oven, even ice cream that melted too quickly in the Texan warmth. Quantities of food that Germany had not seen since before the First World War. The prisoners ate until they could eat no more, some until they were ill, unable to reconcile such generosity with the idea of enemy. "We ate like kings," wrote Feldwebel Hans Richter. "Better than German generals eat, better than party leaders." He underlined the next sentence twice. And this was not special. The guards had told them this was simply a normal American Christmas dinner, that every family across the country was sitting down to the same meal. And the question whispered across every table was the same. If they feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat? By early 1944, curiosity had replaced pride. More than 40,000 German prisoners enrolled in educational programs run by the U.S. Army. They studied English, history, mathematics, physics, subjects once reserved for the elite. The University of Chicago sent correspondence courses. Stanford dispatched professors to lecture on democracy, economics, and philosophy. The thirst for knowledge seemed unquenchable. Men who had been told Americans were cultureless discovered libraries larger than any in Berlin, universities open to every social class, research facilities leading the world. They read newspapers freely, multiple papers, side by side, comparing opinions as one might compare instruments in an orchestra. In Germany, such freedom of thought would have been unthinkable, even fatal. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, he later wrote, taught us without hatred. They spoke of science as something universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared their knowledge with enemies. He underlined the last phrase, shared knowledge with enemies. What kind of civilization does that? Even entertainment became revelation. The camp theaters showed Hollywood films, not propaganda reels. Gone with the Wind flickered on the screen, and in its story of loss and rebuilding, many saw their own future mirrored. The Grapes of Wrath followed, and astonishment rippled through the crowd Americans, showing their own poverty, their own suffering to foreign prisoners. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer wrote, "They hide nothing. They show their failures, their injustices, their doubts. And yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here it is considered patriotic." By spring 1944, as U.S. production reached its zenith, the prisoner labor program expanded once more. Germans worked in canneries, mills, machine shops, watching the vast gears of American industry grind forward at a pace that mocked every Nazi boast. No statistic, no propaganda could match what their eyes confirmed. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, they unloaded steel that would become the landing craft of D-Day. From their workstations, they watched 20,000 American workers, men and women alike, assemble 700 boats every month, each one demanding 20,000 parts. Women doing men's work, Negroes operating complex machinery, teenagers running drills, wrote Stabsfeld Webel Kurt Zimmerman. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy, and yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They built more boats in a month than our Navy in a year. Far north in Ohio, Republic steel burned like a small sun. The furnaces roared day and night, turning out 10,000 tons of steel every 24 hours, fed by endless trains of ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale obliterated comprehension. "I worked at Krupp before the war," wrote Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann. "I thought I understood industry, but this was beyond imagination. They wasted more steel in spillage than we could produce. The workers complained about overtime while creating quantities we could not achieve with slave labor and double shifts." What does a man believe after seeing such things? When the evidence of your own eyes contradicts every sermon you have ever heard, what survives inside you? For thousands of German soldiers in captivity, this question became the quiet battlefield where ideology finally surrendered. The summer of 1944 dawned like a revelation, the final undeniable proof that everything Nazi propaganda had ever claimed about American weakness was a lie. Across the vast heartland of the United States, German prisoners labored side by side with American farmers, their disbelief growing with every acre harvested. Imagine standing beneath the Kansas sun, watching combines sweep through fields that seemed to have no end machines gliding over oceans of gold, each devouring 100 acres a day. Grain elevators rose like fortresses, filled to their steel ceilings with wheat, more than Germany could import in an entire year. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote with stunned clarity, "One American farmer with machinery does the work of 100 German farmers." They showed me aerial photographs, thousands of square miles of wheat. They could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, the abundance took on a surreal quality. The prisoners picked fruit in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon, where perfection was expected, and surplus was discarded without hesitation. Perfectly good, fruit rejected for a blemish, a bruise, a shade too pale. They destroyed food to keep prices stable, wrote Gefreiter Otto Schultz. Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because they had too many. We begged to send them to Germany, to our families. The guards were kind, but said it was impossible. The act was not cruelty, it was policy. Waste, Schultz realized, was a form of wealth. It was the power to choose abundance over desperation. Then came June 6, 1944. The day news of the Normandy landings reached the camps. Disbelief turned into silent surrender. POWs crowded around bulletin boards and radio broadcasts. At Camp Shelby, they even saw the newsreels within days, endless lines of ships, aircraft swarming the skies, artificial harbors conjured out of the sea. 15,000 tons of supplies landed every day across open beaches. The sheer logistics defied imagination. "We knew then that everything was lost," wrote Oberst Friedrich von Steuben. "Not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources. And yet, even more devastating than America's machinery was its humanity." For the first time, the prisoners began to understand the strength that lies in mercy. The propaganda had painted Americans as sentimental, soft, weak, but what they witnessed was something entirely different, a moral confidence so deep it could afford compassion. When Gefreiter Hans Müller received word that his son had been killed in the Hamburg bombings, the American camp commander himself delivered the Red Cross telegram, removed his cap, and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote from Germany that she could not feed their children, American church group citizens of a nation still bombing German cities sent food parcels to her doorstep. They separated the German people from the Nazi regime, wrote Hauptmann Otto Kleist. They told us they were fighting Hitler, not Germans. It sounded like propaganda, but it was true. They were already preparing us to rebuild Germany, not destroy it. The medical wards became another quiet battlefield where compassion triumphed over hate. German doctors worked alongside their American counterparts, learning new surgical methods, using equipment they had never seen before. Operations that only the privileged could afford in Germany were performed freely on prisoners. Mental health treatment, something the Wehrmacht scarcely recognized, was introduced with astonishing sensitivity. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote later, "They treated suicide attempts with counseling, not punishment. Men who broke down were given therapy, not beatings. This humanity toward enemies revealed a strength we had never understood, the confidence of true power." By March 1945, the transformation was complete. The secret re-education program that had begun as an experiment had become a quiet revolution of the mind. In barracks and classrooms, in hospitals and fields, thousands of former soldiers had already begun to lay the foundations of a different Germany, one rebuilt not by ideology, but by the memory of decency shown to them in captivity. By March 1945, the momentum was unmistakable and measurable. More than 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for courses in democracy. Camp papers now ran essays on constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion circles argued late into the night about Germany's post-war future. The program had outrun its own ambitions. Men who had entered the wire as convinced Nazis were drafting plans for democratic reconstruction. Officers, once sworn to Hitler, were sketching how to transplant American agricultural techniques onto German soil. We became missionaries for democracy. Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reichsmarshal, admitted in a 1975 interview, not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation. We saw it working. We saw ordinary people living better than German aristocrats. We wanted that for Germany. The change ran so deep that U.S. authorities began to worry about too much enthusiasm. Some POWs asked to remain in America when the guns fell silent. Others, through camp correspondence programs, met and later married American women. In the 1950s, thousands would emigrate for good. Then came April 1945, and with it, the last searing revelation. As American troops opened the gates of concentration camps, the films and photographs reached the POW compounds. At first, many refused to believe them propaganda, they insisted. But testimony piled up. Statements from U.S. soldiers, newsreels screened in the barracks, and finally, letters from home that confirmed the horror. The psychological shock was total. Men who had clung to a shred of pride in German honor after battlefield defeat now confronted moral ruin. Everything they had fought for had not only lost it, had been evil. Hauptmann Walter Schmidt found the words others could not. We imagined ourselves warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were instruments of criminals. We thought we brought civilization to inferior peoples. We learned we were the barbarians. The Americans we named weak and decadent showed us what civilization truly means. May 1945 arrived, and with it repatriation orders. Emotions were mixed. These men had lived inside an America that contradicted every lesson of their youth. They had eaten better as captives than as frontline soldiers. They had been treated with a dignity their own regime denied them. In the final months, the camps turned into departure schools. U.S. officials organized vocational training, agricultural courses, and political instruction. Some prisoners even learned the outlines of the Marshall Plan before it was public, grasping that the United States intended to rebuild, not punish, Germany. They prepared us to rebuild our country, wrote Oberst Friedrich von Steuben. They gave us skills, knowledge, hope. They turned defeated soldiers into future citizens. To minds formed by Nazi vindictiveness, such generosity from victors was almost incomprehensible. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German POWs left American camps for home. They returned to a nation shattered, divided, flattened, impoverished. Yet many carried something priceless, a working model of how a democratic industrial society functioned. Those who had witnessed American prosperity became, unintentionally, agents of change in post-war Germany. They had seen the gears of industrial efficiency, the scale of agricultural productivity, the civic habits of a prosperous democracy. Reconstruction did not look theoretical to them. It looked achievable because they had watched it in motion. Some of those former prisoners would help steer the new republic. Hans Kroll, once at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who had taught classes at Camp Como, rose to the presidency of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Weckmar, held at Camp Hearn, later served as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Eduard Ackermann, a former inmate at Fort Robinson, became a central figure in agricultural reform. They carried American methods into German workshops, American efficiency onto German farms, and American democratic ideals into German politics. The Wirtschaftswunder of the 1950s rested in part on knowledge first absorbed behind barbed wire in the United States. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs. We saw democracy create wealth, diversity generate strength, and fair treatment of workers raise production. These lessons, learned as prisoners, shaped the new Germany. Historians would later rank the German POW experience in America among the most effective re-education efforts in modern history. It achieved its ends without the cudgel-no-forest orthodoxy, no propaganda, in the old sense. American industrial power and democratic practice did the persuading. The prisoners simply watched a society operate at peak capacity while extending dignity even to its enemies, and what they observed remade them. They had seen it with their own eyes industrial power, on a scale that made German production seem almost medieval. They had lived day by day inside a standard of living so elevated it stripped Nazi propaganda bare, exposing its boasts as fragile fantasies. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the foremost historian of German POWs in America, would later write, "America won the propaganda war not with slogans, but with reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The prisoners were converted by prosperity. The numbers tell the story." Out of 371,683 German POWs held in the United States, fewer than 1% ever attempted escape, just 2,000 out of 222 attempts in total. None succeeded permanently. Most were caught within a day. Post-war surveys revealed that 95% of the prisoners rated their treatment as good or excellent. The conversion wasn't merely political, it was personal. Thousands of former captives corresponded with American families for decades. In 1985, 40 years after the war, more than 500 of those men returned to Austin, Texas, for a reunion. They came with wives, children, grandchildren to show them where their transformation had begun. Former Obergefreiter Hans Wecker, once interned at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, now a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke softly but firmly. Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, we discovered dignity. Former Stabsfeld-Weibel Kurt Meyer, who had labored on Iowa farms, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes even their homes. This humanity, from people whose sons were fighting against us, changed us forever." When the dinner plates were cleared, the keynote speaker, former Oberst Hermann Goetz, 78 years old, rose to address the hall. His words brought the past full circle. We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy in full power. We saw farmers who fed the world, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity. We learned that America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence. We returned to Germany with a mission: to build a nation that could create rather than destroy, that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons learned in American prison camps. We, who came as conquerors, left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends. Thank you for showing us the way. The audience rose as one Americans and Germans together, their applause echoing across generations. And the scale of that quiet revolution can still be read in the ledgers of history. Camp infrastructure, over 500 camps across 45 states, excluding only Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. 175 main camps, 325 branch sites. Built in an average of 90 days, housing from 250 to 12,000 prisoners each. Population, 371,683 German POWs, part of 425,871 total Axis prisoners. Peak population, May 1945. Monthly arrivals averaged 20,000 in 1943, 30,000 after D-Day, and 60,000 in the war's final months. Labor contribution, 14 million man-days in agriculture, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, $230 million in labor value, 1940s dollars. Prisoners earned 80 cents a day and filled critical labor shortages in 46 states. Escape statistics: only 0.6% attempted escape, 2,222 attempts, no successful permanent escapes, no American civilians harmed. Education: over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in formal courses, 135 camp newspapers published, 30,000 studied English, 15,000 entered vocational training, and 8,000 completed university-level correspondence courses. Post-war immigration: around 5,000 former POWs emigrated to the United States. More than 12,000 kept lifelong correspondence with American families' letters, averaging a span of 31 years. Many later returned as tourists or business partners. Treatment assessment: 95% rated their captivity as good or excellent. 74% stated it had changed their worldview for the better. What began as captivity ended as enlightenment. These men had come to America as instruments of tyranny. They returned as witnesses to freedom's quiet power, the kind of power that feeds rather than conquers, that heals rather than humiliates. In the end, it was not bombs or battlefields that broke the spell of Nazism, but something far simpler and infinitely stronger: the undeniable evidence of a better way to live. By 1945, the numbers said what words could barely express. 61% of German POWs in the United States openly wanted to learn about democracy. Fewer than 10% still clung to Nazi ideology. They had come as enemies of freedom, but they would leave as its unlikely students. What they had witnessed was not mere power. It was transformation. American industry, so vast and unending, had done what no propaganda could. Their captivity became their education, their defeat, their awakening, their imprisonment, their liberation from the iron cage of ideology. In the end, America's greatest triumph wasn't won on the battlefield. It unfolded behind barbed wire. There, in the rhythm of factory sirens, in the glow of electric lights, in the taste of food shared without hatred, the United States achieved something armies could not: the peaceful conquest of the human mind. Those who had arrived believing in German superiority and American weakness left knowing the truth. American industrial might wasn't just greater. It was incomprehensible to men shaped by scarcity and fear. The trains that had brought them to Texas in 1943 had carried warriors of the Third Reich. The ships that bore them home in 1946 carried architects of a new democracy. They had seen the future, and it worked. The lesson outlasted the war. America's most powerful weapon was never just its tanks or bombers. It was the visible proof of what a free society could build. The German prisoners were first stunned by that power, then changed by it. In their transformation lay the seeds of Europe's redemption. They returned to Germany not as conquered soldiers, but as witnesses to abundance, to freedom, to the possibility of a civilization built on cooperation rather than conquest. From those seeds grew the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s, a rebirth founded on lessons first learned in American camps, that prosperity comes not from domination, but from liberty, not from racial superiority, but from human dignity, not from control, but from collaboration. They had come expecting to find a weak, divided America teetering on collapse. Instead, they found an industrial giant alive with purpose. Guided by ideals of tolerance and possibility, they arrived as prisoners of war, but departed as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its zenith. In their awe lay the roots of the Marshall Plan, of NATO, of the Atlantic Alliance itself, the understanding that the strength of free peoples was limitless when joined by trust instead of terror. They had seen America, and they would never be the same. Their children would grow up in a Germany allied with the very nation they had once fought, a partnership born not in surrender, but in revelation. It began the day 850 men of Rommel's Africa Corps stepped off a train in Mexia, Texas, and realized that everything they had believed was wrong. The saga of the German POWs in America is, at its core, a story of redemption through revelation. It proves that the greatest victories are not achieved through destruction, but through demonstration, not through propaganda, but through prosperity, not through hatred, but through humanity. Those captured soldiers became the unwitting ambassadors of democracy. They carried home not the shame of defeat, but the knowledge of how free men live and build. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens remains one of history's most extraordinary transformations, accomplished not by force, but by the simple, irrefutable evidence of what freedom can achieve. In the end, that was America's secret weapon, not the ability to outproduce its enemies, but the power to outshine them. The German POWs had come astonished by America's machines, but they left transformed by its spirit, and in that transformation lay the blueprint for a better world.